Merlin. Have you been? I have walked my way since the beginning of time. Sometimes I give, sometimes I take. It is mine to know which and
We have a long legacy of accounts of wizards, necromancers, conjurers, and all the other many names that we have for these incredible sorcerers. Is there some way that they're linked behind the construction of these wondrous edifices that we look at in our explorations every week? Whether we're thinking of some sort of fantasy wizard or perhaps something a little bit more contemporary, such as an alchemist's den, is there a connection to these explorations that we do? Is there a way that they're intrinsically linked? And if so, who are these wizards? And how do they fit into our account and our understanding of the old world and the civilization that came before ours? Join me today as we explore this account of these wizards and how they may be responsible for some of the incredible constructions that we've looked at. Why is it that there is such a link between wizards and fantasy and castles as we explore the Wizards of Tartaria? Who were the Wizards of Tartaria? We've oftentimes heard of historical accounts that relate to Alchemist's Den, and many of us think about our recent experiences. From my particular generation, our first exposure to wizards came from the Wizard of Oz, and actually the witches, who were wizards in and of themselves. Again, relating to the many different names that we have for conjurers. But who exactly is a wizard? And we might recall that in the story of the Wizard of Oz, the eponymous Wizard of Oz was actually not a wizard, but merely an individual that was utilizing theatricality and deception to present themselves as a wizard in order to influence decisions, and ultimately to bring good to the land of Oz, depending on one's perspective. But we look at other accounts of wizards, and we see that there is a rather conflicted account, as always, where we see some wizards who appear to be good and use their powers to bring about what we would consider to be favorable outcomes for the progress of a civilization. And yet there's other accounts of wizards that appear to be evil, who use their powers for relentless destruction. And as we look at all of our fantasy accounts and our legends, and we can find wizards all the way back to the beginning of our written accounts. And once again, it's something else that transcends many different cultures and civilizations. Whether they're called wizards or sorcerers is immaterial, but individuals who appear to have some sort of special power. The ability to conjure matter where matter didn't exist. The ability to use what we would call magic. Is it really just simply magic where a wandering of a hand or some incantation can bring about some sort of result or affect the physical environment? Looking at the other accounts, we even have no shortage of linkages between wizards being evil figures and linked to the ultimate evil. But is this true, or is this merely one series of these accounts? Why is it so difficult to get a clear picture of what a wizard actually is? We do know for sure that wizards have always been with us. But did wizards really start as a part of our civilization, or were they something that were added later? It's really intriguing when you think about how we have these accounts of these alchemists, or the account of the alchemist's den. And what's really the difference between an alchemist and what you would think of as a wizard? There's also that question of why we have so many different names and references to wizards, whether we're saying a sorcerer, a conjurer, a warlock, a witch, and the terms go on. And there are many different terms if we consider many other languages. Were these some sort of special group of people? Were they a completely different species from humanity even? Or could it be that they are simply humans that were endowed with different abilities? Were they endowed from birth, or were they abilities that they had to learn over a period of time? Looking at all of our stated fictional accounts over time, we see that there are many different ways that an individual can become a wizard or a conjurer or sorcerer or sorceress or whatever different name you want to apply. Some were born with the ability. Others were trained over time with the ability. And yet we have other accounts of some that were endowed with the ability even against their will. But because they had some sort of natural capability, they were able to become a wizard or a sorcerer. Indeed, we think of the Marvel example of Doctor Strange. And oddly enough, I would even refer to the account of the 1970s Doctor Strange TV series because it actually deals with the astral plane. And while I'm well aware that there are many different examples of wizards that are certainly more contemporary, the ones that I'm referring to in this exploration have to do with the concept of wizards operating and existing in different planes of existence, almost being a dream and a reality. Indeed, in John Boorman's 1981 film Excalibur, we actually see different examples of wizards, from Merlin to Morgana. Morgana appearing to be a human, and yet utilizing her wit and her guile, is able to actually acquire the powers of the conjurer and use it to affect the plot. And then we also look at the existence of the wizards from the Lord of the Rings series from J.R.R. Tolkien. And we understand that these particular wizards are not actually human beings, but they're spirits, the Maiar, from an entirely higher plane of existence. Is it possible that this is what these account of wizards really are? That they're a completely different race of people that came from another plane of existence? Or perhaps we can't even think of them as a different race of people. Perhaps they're a completely different sort of creature, a more ethereal creature that manages to assume human form. And perhaps that's what's always made wizards so compelling to us, is the different explanations that they may possess. And how do we link this back to our studies and understanding of the old world? Is it possible that previous civilizations interacting with different portals and different forms of existence actually managed to contact these life forms, or this entirely different form of life that was more energy, or perhaps we'd even describe it as spiritual based now? Is that really what the Good Witch actually is? The incarnation of some sort of spirit? Is that what a lot of these wizards or sorcerers have been over time? Actual spirits that assumed a corporeal form and then looked to influence the previous civilization. Indeed, that's what a lot of accounts will tell us, and yet we can't ignore the fact that going all the way back from Arthurian legends to even the modern day, well, relatively modern day Wizard of Oz, or perhaps even the Harry Potter series, we have that wizards do appear to be regular people that are simply endowed with powers. And I certainly invite you to let me know what you think of wizards or sorcerers when you think of them in the comments. How would you describe one? And what was your thought of what their capabilities really were? Can they conjure things? Can they cast spells? Or do they actually have the ability to really manipulate the entire physical environment at will, all around us and all around them? Is it possible that there's still some form of this knowledge, this practice that exists to this day? And is it even possible that there are some human beings to this day that are still endowed with this incredible ability? These are perhaps the most intriguing possibilities. Now, of course, the mainstream and modern science will tell us that this is absurd and that this has been disproven time and time again. And that is certainly the conclusion that's been reached. But yet the legends and the legacies of these wizards, these conjurers, it just does not go away. Their identity, their presence, and the fact that they're still with us, even in a fictionalized world, tells of their lasting legacy. We think of the role that the wizard Merlin played in what we would consider to be the foundation of a reference to the old world, with the kingdom of King Arthur. Because we understand that the way the individuals in that story acted is certainly nothing like what we understand individuals who actually lived in the historical Middle Ages to have acted. There is a significant discrepancy between what really happened, again according to the historical account, and what Arthurian legend states happened during the time frame in the Middle Ages. So we can only conclude that they're referring to very different time frames. When you see these accounts of wizards, though, you consider the mixture of good and evil. And indeed, there are many who simply attribute that all wizards and all forms of conjuring is simply that, the very practice itself is evil. Indeed, it relates to alchemy in that facet, that it is dark arts that should not be practiced, because they could lead to a terrifying result. And yet we could also come to the same conclusion about our modern technology. Our modern technology can bring about favorable results to individuals and to entire civilizations, and yet it can also be destructive to individuals and entire civilizations. And perhaps this is the most compelling evidence that we have of our conclusion in terms of what role wizards played if they did exist in the past. And it's safe to say that there are still some signs, some indications that there really were people who had enhanced capabilities. And some of them may even still be with us today. Is it possible that in the past that these enhanced capabilities went even further? That these conjurers were really capable of bringing about entirely new realms of physical existence? Did they have the capability to simply produce life with the waving of their hands, or the casting of spells, or even mixing of different forms of potion with different forms of understanding? It's very difficult for us to describe and understand, especially those of us who have lived in what we see as an entirely physical world. But we do have accounts of the fact that many people in the past feared wizards and sorcerers and conjurers, and attributed them to evil, and handled them as such. And yet there's other accounts, such as Merlin, of these wizards being the ones who crafted and helped form the early steps of a civilization. Indeed, you can point to the very essential role that Merlin played in bringing about the Kingdom of Camelot. Is it possible that some other wizards were responsible for bringing about a civilization, an ancient technology, an etheric energy that they practiced? And understanding what this etheric technology really is, perhaps that's the key to understanding how these incredible civilizations managed to achieve the things that they did, especially with the constructions that we look at in our explorations. What is etheric energy, and what is the understanding of these wizards? Well, we look at the account of the spirits in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and we have an understanding that spirits existed in a completely different realm, a place that's outside of what we understand as our physical existence. Now, we could certainly look at this as a different spiritual existence, another plane of existence, and as they refer to in Doctor Strange, the TV miniseries from 1970s, they talk about an astral plane. Again, it's another realm, a different form, a completely different place from where we are right now. A lot of people may say that it's simply imaginary, and it could well be. But I think it is one interesting perspective to try to attempt to understand where the presence of wizards and even etheric energy or spiritual energy may come from. It could be entirely possible that there is this place that exists. And I even think of the more contemporary reference in the Warhammer 40k universe, where they talk about the warp zone, or the completely different area where different energies exist. You still have what may be viewed as the spiritual existence of individuals. And perhaps it is true that every single one of us does have a very distinct form of spiritual energy. Some may refer to it as a spirit, others may refer to it as an aura. There's many different ways to perceive it, that there appears to be a intrinsic energy within all of us. Now, is it just simply something that we could easily explain with current scientific methods? Perhaps. Or could it actually allude to something far different? Something that enables us to exist in multiple realities, multiple realms at the same time. And then we have another explanation for the origin of wizards. We have another understanding of where the power and the use of conjuring is actually derived from. The ability to link to this other realm, this spiritual realm. And if you study the account of the spirits, as J.R.R. Tolkien refers to in Lord of the Rings and all of his ephemeral materials, you can start to gain an understanding for how there is a completely different realm. You can have a perspective for where these spirits tend to exist and how they're able to take form in the physical realm, and yet they still have access to the greater powers from their other realm. Or perhaps there's more of a technological explanation for it. Perhaps there really is a capability or a technology that existed in the past that enabled corporeal forms or people in our reality to connect to other realities, other forms of existence where they were able to draw on a special energy, an energy from that other form of existence that they were able to incorporate and utilize in our present reality. And perhaps that is one of the easiest ways to understand wizards and conjurers. Perhaps that's the very origin of their power, the origin of what we would consider to be the etheric energy. But there's many different perspectives behind it, and I certainly invite you to share your opinion in the comments. What do you think is the origin of it? And what do you think is the true nature of these wizards? Looking here, we actually have the genealogy of the Ionar, or the Aenar. There's many different ways to pronounce it. The spirits that existed in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series. The highest of the spirits being the Valar. Essentially deities in many ways, and yet deities with their own characteristics and their own particular forms of individuality. And then we have the other spirits, the Maiar. And if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, you might recall that the Maiar actually incarnated as 5 wizards to assist humanity, the elves, the dwarves, and the other physical beings that existed in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth at the time. There's also the fact that there were dark spirits, or shadow spirits, that took other forms that were far more terrifying and horrific, to even include the demons of the ancient world, or the Balrogs, who were actually demons themselves, originally spirits. Also looking at the account of the original Morgoth, who was one of the Valar who became corrupted. And it's here that we see a lot of the origin stories for our own current perception of good and evil. Is it possible that there's a lot more to this account that we don't understand to this day? Is it possible that there are other forms of spirits that may have incarnated in some sort of corporeal existence? We think of one of the Maiar, or one of the other spirits from J.R.R. Tolkien's legend that incarnated as Sauron, the Dark Lord, and consider the fact that perhaps this is where we have all these accounts of evil that tend to be associated with wizards. But not all wizards start off as evil or began as evil. In fact, many were good, such as the 5 wizards who were sent to Middle-earth to help the elves, humanity, the dwarves, and all the others with managing the return of an ancient evil to the land. Who exactly were these people? We understand that they were spirits such as Saruman that took corporeal form to provide their wisdom and their aid, and yet some were corrupted such as Saruman. And then there was Gandalf, who started off as Gandalf the Grey, and then was reincarnated as Gandalf the White to take over the Order. There was Radagast, who did not prefer to play an active role with humanity, but rather with the animals, and then simply returned. And then there's the lesser-known blue wizards, who went far out east, and we don't exactly know what their fate is. Is it possible that what Tolkien was really referring to was some sort of historical event that may have occurred? Is it possible that there were wizards in the past, or perhaps even individuals who had greater capabilities, who managed to survive what we think of as a reset, and then they were the ones who came to the new civilization to guide it and to help it establish itself? And much like the wizards in J.R.R. Tolkien's account, perhaps the wizards in reality were also susceptible to corruption. That there were some who, instead of deciding to utilize their knowledge and their power for good, decided to utilize their knowledge and power for evil and corruption, because for whatever reason they had become corrupted. Think on that. Think on the capabilities of the power that wizards could have. There's also the ongoing mentality that we have that's referred to in some stories, such as in the film Big Trouble in Little China and in the film Excalibur, where we see that wizards may have different forms of existence, that they can be corporeal, but they can lose their corporeal bodies and then only exist as spirits, or as it's referred to in both of those films, they are merely dreams. And yet they are still dreams that can interface with the physical world and influence the physical world. Indeed, the sorcerer Lo Pan in Big Trouble in Little China is trying to recover from a curse to regain his physical body. And that's one of the main plot points of that particular film. There's the account of Merlin in the 1981 film Excalibur, who begins as a corporeal being, but then loses his form and only exists as a shadow or a spirit. And how do we explain the construction? Well, we have this link back to the concept of alchemy. Now, is alchemy really a form of conjuring, or is it just simply more of a form of knowledge? A knowledge of mixing different materials and having the capability to produce and yield other materials. And this is where we see the real explanation for how wizards may have played a very active role in our understanding of the old world. Indeed, a lot of the symbolism in the old world perspective involves having a physical realm. But then as you work your way out from the physical realm, you reach what we would consider to be the ethereal realms, the astral plane, and there's many different terms for it. And perhaps this is referencing the connection between our reality and other realities. It's not simply a product of the imagination or science fiction. It's possible that there could be a true connection. Because many people say there are so many things that we can't quantify, that we can't measure by science, such as emotional connections. And perhaps there's many other outcomes that we simply can't explain with measuring something with a cup or some sort of device. It's just simply not possible. And yet perhaps the real link between a scientific understanding and a spiritual understanding comes from this amalgamation, this concept of this existence between the ability of alchemy and a spiritual existence. Now just imagine if you had the ability to do both, if it was a combination of knowledge with endowed capability, or an even higher knowledge of a way to access one of these realms. Perhaps this is what alchemy is really referring to, and perhaps this is the reference that we have, the understanding for how not only were they able to construct these incredible structures that are still with us today, but they were actually able to produce the impressive and enduring construction materials, which we don't seem to have the ability to match to this day. There's a reason why we still associate castles as a fairy tale existence, and the simple explanation is because many times their construction seems impossible. Now, yes, there are more rudimentary castles that we could say we could construct to this day, employing all of our methods, but yet there are other castles that you can find across the land, or palaces, or whatever term we want to assign to them, that seem to be completely beyond our capability to construct. And we've looked at many of these structures in our exploration on this channel. Is it possible that the Wizards of Tartaria are the ones who really were endowed with the knowledge that made these constructions possible? Something that defies our ability to explain with our current means of construction, but may be very easily explained if we consider the process of alchemy, and if we consider the wizards or the alchemists or the conjurers who had the knowledge, a different story of lost records. Perhaps we all have this intrinsic ability locked within all of us, and we simply lack the knowledge to tap into these other realms, these other forms of reality, and to draw on this etheric energy, this energy that we could then channel from this other reality into our present physical reality. And that's why we have all these accounts and all these stories of these conjurers, these alchemists in the past, who made such a difference on their civilization. And perhaps as we go further back in the past, we had examples of wizards who had even greater capability, such as Merlin. Not only were they able to create or to facilitate the creation of these incredible construction materials, but they also had a knowledge of an older civilization, perhaps even a higher form of being for the physical realm that we have. And this is perhaps the most interesting accounts that we have of wizards, why they continue to endure with us to this day. It's not just simply the ability to wave your hands and to produce incredible physical results. It comes down to having an innate knowledge, a knowledge that actually goes beyond physical limitations. Because we have the fantasy perception of wizards as battling demons and creatures from other dimensions, and perhaps there may even be a form of truth to that. Perhaps that's something that still occurs to this very day that goes on behind the scenes, or perhaps it occurs in a reality that we're not even able to perceive. Could it have been that the alchemists of the past were the very last generation or the last group of individuals that really had this higher knowledge, this ability to tap into other realms and this etheric energy, to employ it in a way that could affect the physical world? Is this the reason why they were so feared and so despised at the time? That there were others that may have resented their existence? Or is it possible there was even a schism between these higher knowledged individuals that there was one group that wanted to preserve the original values of a civilization, and there was another group that decided to corrupt it for their own means and power. And indeed, we find analogies to this, especially in the 1981 film Excalibur, where we see that there's an individual that has a form of righteousness to them, and even one of their family members was wronged, but in the aspect of pursuing their revenge, they become the worst evil themselves. It's a story that repeats in many time frames, and in many different inclinations we have the idea that all of us are susceptible to this form of corruption, that all of us have the ability to be good, and all of us have the ability to be evil. Now imagine if we had greater capabilities. Imagine if all of us could really influence the physical world in much greater ways. And as stated earlier, perhaps we do actually have this capability and it's locked away within us somewhere. That it's something that we could gain an understanding of if we're actually able to pursue the knowledge. Or it could all simply be the product of fantasy. Perhaps it was merely some esoteric knowledge or something that was just a little different than what the mainstream understanding was at the time, and over time it's been inflated by legend and myth. Although I'm always amazed by how many times there seems to really be something behind legend and myth. How there seems to be a lot more reality behind it than we might initially like to think. And some would even argue that our historical accounts going back to Rome are really based on legend and myth, although that's merely one perception, and I'm not embracing that or saying that's the correct way to look at it. Just that it's very interesting that we have very limited accounts from events that occurred 2,000 years ago, and yet we're able to derive and have a detailed understanding of exactly what unfolded. Always very interesting that we have so much question about what transpired in the 1800s, and yet we can tell you what Julius Caesar was having for dinner right before he was assassinated. Now, yes, I'm embellishing that a little bit, but you understand the point. How could we actually have more detail from more distant times in the past than what we have presently? And what do wizards really represent? Are they just a fantasy element in our minds to explain things we don't understand? Or is there a reality behind them? Because when you look at every palace, every opera house that we understand were constructed from the 15 to the 1800s, do we really attribute them to being constructed by the technological means at the time as we understand them, given our official historical account? Or is it possible that there had to be a higher knowledge that was applied? We theorize that there oftentimes was a higher knowledge and a greater capability that was applied. How do you actually circumvent logistical limitations unless you had a true greater capability? Someone who had a greater understanding of geometric precision. But not only that, the ability to fabricate materials that would endure not just for tens of years, but for hundreds or even thousands of years. Now, of course, the official explanation for this will be that some people had a greater knowledge of material construction, or it's simply medieval masonry, and that explains everything. And yet there's a conflicting account with our understanding of knowledge during the medieval times or Middle Ages, and it does not correspond with the results of the structures that we see to this day. There's also many other discrepancies that we have with the timeline, or the time frame, with many of these constructions being completed over a period of hundreds of years, which gives problems, as opposed to the constructions within the United States that tend to have been completed in a very short amount of time. So the account seems to differ depending where you are in the land, and yet the results that you can actually see when you don't consider the historical account are very similar. So is it really showing a difference in capability, or is it showing a previous civilization that all existed at the same time frame? Ultimately, that's your conclusion to make. And all are welcome here to express their opinion, whether you embrace the mainstream historical chronology or if you believe that there is an alternative explanation for why we have these incredible structures. The exploration of the wizards is one theory, one possible explanation for why it was we were able to construct in this manner, and why we were able to do it all over the land with tremendous results. There's many places that we haven't explored yet that we will continue to explore, looking at what our historical account is and trying to gain an understanding. But we're also going to continue to posit more theories as we go forward, trying to understand exactly what it was that occurred in our past. And I never pull anything off the table, because I believe that many more things are possible than are impossible than what we'd like to believe. How exactly do you explain a structure like this, constructed in the distant past? And do we have remaining wizards to this day? Let's consider the example of Lopan.
The fairies are out of balance.
As they are in Lopan, who is cursed.
Then the people turn into demon and live forever.
Is this David Lopan? What is he, a ghost?
Plays at being a man.
And perhaps this is the example I referred to along with the example of Merlin. Two individuals who are sorcerers, wizards, who attempted to affect the outcome of the physical environment in their respective stories. I've always found, though, the account and the portrayal of Merlin in the 1981 film Excalibur to be the most compelling. We understand that Merlin is some sort of immortal individual. He does not age, despite the passage of many decades in the story, and he tries to positively affect the outcome of establishing a true balanced civilization. And for a time frame in the film, with King Arthur and Camelot, they do establish a balanced civilization. And yet in the process of doing this, though, the seeds of its destruction were already sown, namely because of the fact that Merlin, despite being a wizard, does make mistakes. I also appreciate the fact, though, in the portrayal in this particular film, that Merlin is not human. There seems to be something more behind him, and maybe that's the real explanation behind wizards. And indeed, there is the line that Morgana says that he's not a man, he's not a god. And perhaps that is very, very true. And yet Merlin does actually bring about the positive outcome of Camelot. His initial attempt fails when he puts his support behind King Uther, namely because of the fact that while King Uther is a great warrior, as Merlin says, he was never able to look into the hearts of men, most of all his own. And as a result of this led to his own downfall when he betrayed the Duke of Cornwall. The Duke of Cornwall's daughter, Morgana, seeking revenge many years later, manages to steal magic from Merlin and brings about the ruination of the land. A very compelling story. And I think what's also interesting is the fact that Merlin has a special relationship and takes an active role in raising Arthur, which is very different than Uther. Morgana also attempts to raise her own child, endowed with magic, to bring about a different sort of land. And I appreciate the portrayal by Helen Mirren in this very complex and interesting character, because I believe this may be telling us stories that occurred in the past. There's also the facet that Merlin was the one who was responsible for taking care of Arthur. Now, while he did not actually raise Arthur, he certainly watched over him, and also played a significant role as Arthur's mentor once Arthur came of age and began his quest to unify the land. And Merlin became a primary advisor, a friend, and a father figure to Arthur. And it's very intriguing to me when you watch the film the different way in which Uther, Arthur's father, and Arthur himself regard Merlin. Uther seems to have no time for Merlin and pays him no respect. And Arthur is saddened when Merlin leaves, when Merlin says that he's going to depart, with the great line that there are worlds other than this, and this one is done with me. Perhaps what we see in this portrayal, this depiction in the film Excalibur, is the most realistic form of what wizards may have once been. Or perhaps it's something else entirely. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. How do you view wizards and conjurers? What do you believe is their actual origin? And what role do you think they played in the old world? Or perhaps I'll just leave Merlin's departing line. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.